Like it or not, the senior and elderly population is vulnerable to negligence committed by medical professionals, nursing home and assisted living facilities, pharmaceutical and medical device companies, insurance companies, and everyday individuals and businesses. The Injured Senior Podcast is here to help. Steve Heisler is the creator of the National Injured Senior Law Center and has been advocating for seniors' rights for over 20 years. You have questions, and Steve Heisler has answers. This is the Injured Senior Podcast.
Hello, guys and gals of the Injured Senior community. This is attorney Stephen Heisler, and I am the founder and CEO of the National Injured Senior Law Center. I am also the host of this show, the Injured Senior Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. William Vigilante. Dr. Vigilante is a human factors and ergonomics consultant with experience researching topics related to pedestrian and premises safety, driver performance and roadway safety, lighting and night vision, the design of warnings and instructional information, risk perception, and the effects of aging on performance, safety, and product design. Dr. Vigilante's extensive resume includes the publication of dozens of scientific papers in the field of human factors and ergonomics, and he has testified as an expert witness in federal and state courthouses across the country. Dr. Vigilante's expertise is in studying human performance issues and how they should be assessed in the investigation of many incidents to determine if and how they may have played a role in the outcome of an event. One issue includes aging, and we have Dr. Vigilante here today to discuss this topic. Hello, Dr. Vigilante. How's it going up there in the great state of Pennsylvania?
It is going well, thank you.
I bet your wife is happy that baseball is on hold.
Yeah, I think she was more happy that the hockey season was postponed.
Hockey definitely is one of the four major sports, but in this household, baseball is number one. So my wife she is just banging pots and pans. Anyway, so Bill, can you tell our senior and elderly community what a human factors expert, and I believe ergonomics is you also are considered an expert in ergonomics, and they're the same thing, correct?
Correct. Human factors and ergonomics are two terms for the same field of study. They're synonyms, if you will.
Great. And so tell our community a little bit about what human factors is.
But in a nutshell, human factors or ergonomics is the study of how people use all different types of products, how they interact with their environments, how they move about their environments. And essentially, human factors and ergonomics is basically designing for people use. We look at products, we look at buildings, we look at vehicles from the standpoint of the people that are going to be using them, as opposed to the underlying technologies that a mechanical or electrical engineer would be interested in. So our focus is always person or human focus.
And is your focus also on, when studying these environmental entities, how to make it safer for everyday people or things like that?
Yeah, so there are basically three goals for human factors in ergonomics and design. And they are to improve efficiency. We want the most efficient interaction that we can design or provide. We want our users and our people to be comfortable. If people are not comfortable in the work they're doing, the environments that they're in, or the products they're using, they're not going to want to use the products or be in those environments and so forth. And the third pillar or goal of human factors in ergonomics is safety. So people are in the system. From a human factors and ergonomics standpoint, we don't want the equipment in the system to get damaged, but we're more concerned about the people. that are involved being injured. So the safety of the user is a primary concern for human factors and ergonomics and design.
Great. All right. So for the purpose of this podcast today, Bill, if you don't mind, I think we want to really focus on the safety issues that you study as a human factors ergonomics expert. And that leads me to my next question. Why should the senior and elderly community care about human factors and ergonomics? Is it because safety is such a big concern for them being of advanced age or because of age?
It's certainly part of it. And the other part of it is that from a human factors and ergonomics standpoint, because we're interested in the user, we want to be able to identify all the different potential characteristics of the users that are going to be involved with the product or the environment or what have you. And different subsets of the population, that is, for example, with respect to age, older adults, kind of younger adults, and children are kind of the three big categories, if you will. They all have different needs, they all have different abilities, they all have different limitations. And when you're designing products focused on a particular segment, for example, toys, you want to make sure you're dealing specifically with those characteristics, abilities, and limitations of children. If you're dealing with things that are more geared toward the elderly population, you want to make sure that those characteristics and abilities and limitations are directly addressed. And if you're designing for the general public, you want to make sure that you're covering all three of those categories, because all members of those population groups or subsets of those population groups would be potentially exposed to the environment, to the product, and you want to make sure that you're covered for all age ranges.
Well, I know this is a general question, but are products made with the aging population in mind in general? I mean, I know that's a very wide open question, but this is the Injured Senior podcast. So we're excited to hear what your thoughts are.
It's essentially yes and no. And what I mean by that is that there are designers and manufacturers of products specifically for those products geared to an older or elderly population. So, for example, medications that are geared towards elderly folks or medical devices that are geared towards elderly folks, they tend to take into consideration the abilities and limitations of older adults in their design, whether it be the size of the product or the size of the print on the labeling. It could be the strength required to use the product. So, for example, a Tylenol or an ibuprofen or another over-the-counter medication that is used for the general public typically come with childproof caps on them. Well, childproof caps are great to prevent young kids from getting into the medication, but they are an impediment to older adults using the medication. Older adults, one of the characteristics and limitations you find is that they're more likely to have problems with strength and rotation of the hands and wrists. So these childproof caps become problematic for an older adult. So if you have medications that are geared to older adults, they tend to be in containers that don't have childproof caps. So that's just kind of another example of ways that certain products or category of products are designed specifically with the needs of the elderly population taken into consideration.
Are there certain products that, in your opinion, the business community, product manufacturers have missed the boat and are actually a big problem for the senior and elder population?
There are, and generally a big problem. And I want to give a little bit of background about myself. I've done a lot of research into how to design warnings and instructional information, particularly for the elderly population. And one of the things that you often find when you go down to whether it be like a home improvement store like a Lowe's or a Home Depot, or even your grocery store, But the labeling on the product packaging is presented in font sizes, that is the size of the text, in sizes that are too small or difficult for older adults to read. So one of the issues that older people have or people encounter and becomes more problematic as they age is that some of their visual abilities decrease and are more likely to decrease. So, for example, the ability to read small print on a packaging becomes more and more difficult as we progress past the age of approximately 40, with being really difficult when we get into our 70s and 80s. And so if the product manufacturer or the warning designer or the instructional material designer isn't keeping that into account, they can provide a very small text on their product labels, and that creates problems for the elderly trying to figure out what the proper way to use the product is and or what are the hazards and risks that they need to be aware of.
I can identify with that. I'm 58 and I can barely see 1 foot in front of me. So, you know.
So this was recognized by the FDA a number of years ago. A lot of research I did in graduate school was focused on how to present over-the-counter medication labeling, particularly for older adults. And one of the recommendations we had was that you don't provide print smaller than an 8-point font. And that was a recommendation that the FDA took into account. They provide some leeway for manufacturers of products with smaller labels. But one of the things that we did stress is that a smaller container is not an excuse to provide small print, because you can do things to create a larger label surface. And one of those is the pull-out type label, which have become more popular in the last 10 to 15 years.
Are most pharmaceutical companies or other businesses, I mean, are they missing the mark on that? Are they? I mean, is that a big problem nowadays?
It remains to be an issue with certain products, and again, it really typically points back to a bad design, because the designers, more worried about putting all the information into the smallest possible size onto the smallest possible label for various reasons. And they're not recognizing that they're just making it difficult, not just for elderly users, but for all users to be able to read and access that information.
So can you give an example of like a danger that could pose as a result of making the font or the print too small?
Sure. So, for example, if you go down to a home improvement store like a Lowe's or a Home Depot or a Maynard's, and you pick up a product that has flammable or physical hazards associated with it. Maybe it's combustible vapor. That is, the vapor can travel to an ignition source like a lit pilot light and travel back and explode the container. If the font size is too small, or if the warning's printed in a small font size on the back of the can, an elderly user who's looking for information, may not be able to read that information, may not realize that risk is there, and then potentially expose themselves to it. And then you can have a fire and explosion and either property damage and or injury involved.
And have you seen situations like that in your capacity as a human factors expert? In other words, you give your expert testimony as to this type of a situation. Do you actually see this happening in reality?
It does occur. It does occur. Again, oftentimes labeling is problematic because the information is presented in a small text. And the other problem I typically see is the information is presented in a condensed format. And what I mean by that is it's presented in like a run-on paragraph where there are 3, 4, 5, maybe half a dozen or more different topics that are all presented in a single paragraph where the sentences just keep on running on. And we know from testing with both not normal, but younger adults and older adults, that if you break that information up into a bulleted list, with white spacing or more spacing between the different topics, it's easier for the user to read. They can glean or capture more information from reading the label, and they're more willing to read the label because it's not difficult. So one of the things we know from a human factors and ergonomics standpoint is again, if you make things difficult or uncomfortable for the user, they're not going to want to do it. And this does have safety ramifications. If you make things too difficult, and what we usually term that is as you're increasing the cost of compliance, you're going to see reduction in people doing what is proper or is necessary or what is needed to be safe.
That is good information, Bill. That really is good information. Let me ask you about this. So a lot of seniors and elders have problems with weight bearing and with falls, and that results in broken hips and broken legs, all kinds of bad things. What are some opinions or observations that you have about slip and falls in public or on premises? What are some of the problems from a human factors standpoint that you see that result in slip and falls, especially amongst elders and seniors?
Well, it's kind of funny. Older adults, particularly those with shorter gaits, that is, they take shuffle steps, if you will, are less prone to slipping. And the reason for that is because of the dynamic forces involved in normal gait, where there's a down component and a forward component. And slipping is often the result of that forward movement not being restrained by the friction provided by the flooring. So, regular hardwood floor or ceramic tile floor, the foot goes down and forward, and there's enough friction to stop the foot. But on ice, or if you put like water on that flooring, that friction decreases and that foot slides forward. And what happens is the foot goes forward beyond your center of gravity, and it causes you to lose your balance and fall. But an older person who's shuffling their feet is essentially acting like a younger person who knows they're walking on ice. Because if you know you're walking on ice or a slippery surface, one of the things you do to compensate is to take shorter steps. And what that shorter step or shuffle step does is it reduces the forward forces each successive foot placement, which reduces the chance of slipping. Now, with that said, older adults are more susceptible to other types of problems in the walkway for reasons associated with the deteriorating strength in the legs and the core muscles, the performance decrements in balance, their ability to react fast to take a what we call a compensatory step, which is essentially basically like a stumble to regain your balance. These things all become more problematic for older adults. And so what you see is they become more susceptible to other types of problems, other types of defects in the walkway. And then, of course, as you notice, one big disadvantage for older adults tends to be is that when they do fall or when they do lose their balance, A, they can't recover, and B, when they fall, they're more at risk of injury, and they're more at risk of a significant injury, particularly like a hip fracture or broken hip. And older adults are more likely not to recover, and you see a higher mortality rate from fall injuries.
So with that being said, what generally can businesses or municipalities do better, taking into consideration the challenges that the aging population has when they're walking on walkways or when they're ambulating on walkways?
So in general, there are walkway safety standards and building codes that focus on eliminating problematic conditions in the walkway for all users. So they prohibit changes in elevation over a 1/4 inch without having a beveled edge, a 1/2 inch, whether it's beveled or not, And what they're doing is they're attempting to remove potential trip hazards from the environment. They have certain requirements for stairs to make sure that the stair and its location and the nosings of the stairs, that is the edge of the stair treads, are visible, and they limit the height of risers on the stairs because we know, again, lower body and core strength of elderly folks decreases. And therefore, if you have a high riser, that is the height between successive steps or successive treads, becomes greater the harder it is to either ascend or descend the stair. You need more strength to do it, more lower body strength. Again, as you're losing lower body strength as you age, it becomes more treacherous. So the building codes and the safety standards, they look to limit them. So one thing, certainly a retail store manager or a property owner will want to do is to make sure they're complying with building codes and prevalent walkway and stair safety guidelines.
Are they complying generally, or are you seeing that there's a lack of compliance with these retail establishments?
So I get involved in typically cases where there's a violation of these standards and codes, and hazards exist or are allowed to exist in the walkway. But for the most part, generally speaking, property owners and retailers do a good job of eliminating trip and slip hazards in their stores and their environments.
That's good to know.
Before I move on, Steve, I want to make one thing clear, that the general standards and guidelines are there for like general stores and your general public areas. But when you're dealing with nursing homes, elder care units, typically you require a greater level of care. And one of the reasons for that is demonstrated in the trip hazard requirement, or the walkway change in elevation requirement. Is generally you'd want to have nothing over a quarter-inch height differential between adjacent walking surfaces to prevent trips in the general public without having that elevation change beveled or sloped or ramped. And then you don't want to have anything over a half inch without treating it as a stair or a ramp. And the reason for that, those height requirements, is the average height that the average person lifts their foot during the swing phase of walking. That is when their foot swings from behind them to in front of them. We know with older adults that height decreases as you age. And so what that means is that a quarter-inch to a half-inch may be cleared by your younger adult. An older adult may not clear it. And so quarter-inch is problematic, more likely to be problematic for an older adult than it is the general population. So if you're dealing with an environment in which you have a large population of elder adults, this is something you may want to keep in mind and consider, that you can't be relying upon the minimum codes. You should be going above it and making sure that you have height differentials or no height differentials. And if you do, they're less than a quarter-inch.
That's great information, Bill. That really is great information. And I think trip hazards in nursing homes or senior centers or any type of business or establishment where there's going to be a huge amount of seniors and elderly on the premises, I mean, that's something that I'd really like to delve deeper into on a future episode, because we do have a lot of listeners who are either in a nursing home or at an assisted living facility or go to senior centers. And this is information, this is stuff that they need to hear, as well as their loved ones who are also listening. Let me ask you this real quickly. What about lighting and senior and elderly drivers? What is the situation with lighting? And is it safe for seniors and elders to go out, in the evening? What types of challenges are they facing?
And that's a better way to put it, I think, Steve, is what challenges they're facing. As we age, one of the issues we have is our visual abilities start to decrease. And vision is dependent upon light. And so for a given light level, particularly when it gets dim, younger folks are going to be able to have an easier time seeing than older adults. And of course, in the driving environment or even in the walking environment, typically we're identifying hazards that have potential significant and severe consequences to our health and well-being are detected visually. So you can imagine whether it's in the driving environment or the walking environment, low light becomes problematic and it increases the risk of encountering a hazard and not avoiding it in time or having time to avoid it. So typically in the driving environment, we are dependent upon our headlights and we're dependent upon street lighting and to a lesser extent, lighting from nearby businesses or homes or what have you. In good lighting situations, elderly drivers are, and what I mean by that is a relatively high level of street lighting. Elderly drivers benefit greatly. When there's no street lighting, when there's no lighting from ambient buildings and so forth, older drivers have a harder time at night. I think that's relatively clear. And that puts them at greater risk of encountering roadway hazards and so forth. But one of the interesting things is that we find is that older drivers tend to compensate for their degraded visual abilities by traveling slower. So I think it's maybe the old example of there's you getting stuck behind the little old lady in her car, driving 5 or 10 miles below the speed limit. It's very annoying and irritating for the people behind her, but she's not doing it on purpose. She's doing it because she's trying to compensate for the deficits in her visual and cognitive and physical abilities.
That makes sense. Bill, this 30 minutes is flown by. We have some further conversations to get involved in because I definitely want to, for a future episode, talk about, again, because we have so many listeners that are in senior facilities. We want to know a little bit more about the trip hazards and what the standard of care is and what these facilities should be doing to make sure that our loved ones aren't unnecessarily breaking hips and breaking limbs because it's just too dangerous to transverse in these in these facilities. Anyway, really, thanks so much for coming on today and talking about human factors and ergonomics and the senior and elderly population. Now, if somebody wants to learn more about, what you do, or if they want to get in touch with you to discuss a situation that they're curious about, how can they get in touch with you?
I have a website. It is vigilanteforensic.com. That has my contact information, a copy of my CV, information on my background, education, and so forth, and also the types of work that I do. That's the best way.
Yeah, that's great. And I've been on the site, a lot of good stuff on there, so they definitely should get on over to that site. That's it for now, guys and gals. If you have a topic that you think would be of interest to our injured senior and elderly community and you'd like me to do a show on it, email me at info@injuredseniorhotline.com. You can also email me if you have a potential case you'd like to discuss at any time. Email me. Also, if you like the content we discussed today in this episode, please head over to the show notes where you will find a summary of today's show and any important links we mention in this episode. And always, again, feel free to reach out to me about your own story as an injured senior or elder at info@injuredseniorhotline.com. Thanks again for listening to today's show. Be sure to tune in to next week's show, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks again, Bill, and we'll talk to you soon, Bill.
Thanks, Steve.
All right, take care now.
Thanks for listening to the Injured Senior Podcast with Steve H. Heisler. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate, subscribe, review, and share on Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, or to get help anytime, go to injuredseniorhotline.com or call 855-622-6530. We'll see you next time.